So I'm going to explain a little bit about how I use my proficiency scales in my classroom. So when I first got all my scales made, I basically used them for everything after that. So I use them for planning both my daily activities and also planning my units. I use them in the classroom a lot with the kids, and I also use them for assessments to rate my assessments. So I'm going to start by showing how I use them to plan. So for each of my scales, I just make a copy of the scale. So this is the factoring polynomials one that we're working on in Algebra 1. And at the beginning of the unit, I'll just make a copy of it. And then I just add in all of these reds. I find activities that I want to do for each of the I can statements in the scale, because you have to directly teach everything in the scale. So I'll find activities for each of the statements in the scale. And then this ends up being my unit. I always start from the bottom. So day one's down here. And then I basically have the same setup for each unit. I teach all of the level 2 skills, and then we have just a level 2 assessment. After that assessment, then we will practice those skills that they're missing in level 2. We teach all the level 3 skills and then have another assessment that has levels 2 and 3 on it. Then after that, we practice again the ones that they're missing, in addition to pushing the 4s up to the 4. And then we take one more assessment in class. So for each unit, I give 3 in-class assessments, and then they are still allowed to reassess outside of class time if they would like to do that. So that's how I use my scales to plan each of my units. So then I also use my scales in classes with the kids. So each of the kids in my class has a binder that stays in the classroom. And the first thing that they do when they get into the classroom is they pick up their binders. So I just took pictures of the first pages of one of my students' binders. So this is her first page. So this is basically like so far what we've done in Algebra 1 and her current scores in each of the scales. So we are almost done with our factoring polynomials 1. We're done with level 2, and we're just going to start level 3 tomorrow. So she has her current score. This is her scores for our first scale. This is her scores for our second. And then we haven't even taken a level 3 assessment yet on factoring. So this is her very first page, and it's kind of just a summary of what we've done so far. And she keeps track of that in her binder when she gets her assessments back. Her next page then is the first scale that we worked on. So this is the first scale that we did. Following that is her tracking for just her scores on that scale. So this is specific to the components of an expression scale that we just looked at. So this is new for me this year. I haven't done this before, but the kids are making a double line graph. They're tracking all this again. So their scale scores, the scores that they get on their assessment are in blue. And then they also track their own effort. Their effort scores are not given by me. They're like a self-assessment of their effort. So here on the scale, on the assessments, this student started at a 1.5 on our first assessment. On the second one, they were up to a 2.5. And on the third one, they were up to a 3.5. And then she also rated her own effort. So then after that would be any of the assessments that we've taken. So here's like our first assessment and her score on it. And then she would also, following that, she would have her third assessment and fourth assessment and any more assessments that we took on that scale. And then after that, it just starts over. So then it would be our next scale, another tracking sheet with the double line graph, and then any assessments that they have after that. So each kid has their own binder, and they keep track of where they are for each of the scales that we have assessed on. The last thing I'm going to explain is how I actually make an assessment using a proficiency scale. So when I start making assessments, like I said before, I first start by teaching all of the level 2 skills, and then I have a level 2 assessment. So this is the one we're working on right now for factoring in Algebra 1, and I have taught all of these skills individually. So at the end of that, at the end of this blue I can define zeros of a polynomial, we will take a level 2 assessment. So when I make the assessment, I have the scale sitting right next to me, and I just go line by line. I can factor the greatest common factor. I'll make 1 or 2 assessment questions that assess their ability to do that. Then I go to the next line. I can factor a trinomial with a lead coefficient of 1. And I'll make a couple of assessment items for that. So I just go one by one. And if a student wants to get a 2, they have to be able to do all of these level 2s. So if you leave one out, so for example, in this specific scale, we did take an assessment right before we did grouping. only for me. I wanted to know how the kids were doing and what needed to be retaught and who needed to practice what. So I didn't even have either of these two I can statements on there. So the highest that these kids would have gotten on it would be a 1.5, because they're not showing me that they know how to do that entire level 2. They're only showing me they know how to do some of it. So they would get a 1.5. If they want to get a 2, they have to be able to show me that they can do all of the level 2s. If they want to get a 3, they have to be able to do all the 2s and all of the 3s. And then the same with the 4. So the proficiency scales in my room are the basis of everything. I use them to plan. I use them in class with students when we're starting a lesson. Every single day, I have them open their binders to the scale that we're working on, and then I'll show them where we are. Today, we're going to talk about factoring by grouping, which is right here in level 2. Yesterday, we did this one. So we just are continually talking about where we are in the scale. Also on assessments, I definitely let them know, like, the highest you can get on this is a 1.5, or this is a level 2 assessment. So you can get a 2 on it. It has all the level 2s on it. And then also on the assessments, the students asked if we would put the level of question on there too. So my assessments will say number 1, and it'll, in parentheses, it'll have a 2, and that means it's a level 2 question, and then it'll have the question. And the kids really like to see that also. So proficiency scales are just basically the basis for everything that happens in my classroom.